Luo River, summer 688 CE. A wandering official strolls the banks, looking for stones. For this river is known for delivering prophecy, and at very special times, messages will appear from heaven. Suddenly, a flat white stone catches his eye. Picking it up, he finds it has writing on it. A sage mother shall come to rule all mankind, it says, and eternal prosperity will result. Soon, the Dowager Empress Wu Zetian brings the entire court to the river to offer thanks for the prophecy that she is sure refers to her. After all, there are already monks who are creating a new translation of the Great Cloud Sutra with a passage about how a celestial bodhisattva will return in the body of a woman and rule the earth. So this stone cannot be a coincidence. And it's not, because that translation is sponsored by Wu herself, and the man who found the stone just so happens to be her nephew. Thanks so much to Incogni for helping to keep people's personal data personal. Most historians pin the revelation of the White Stone as the moment that Wu Zetian decided that she would usurp her son and rule in her own name. Upon its discovery, she adopted a new title of Sage Mother Divine Sovereign. And not content with that, she then started talking about opening a new ritual building, or Ming Tang, and called the extended imperial family to the capital. This was worrying. See, opening a Ming Tang was often how you began a new reign, and this one was huge, the largest wooden structure in the world at the time. And Wu's insistence that the imperial family attend sure looked like an attempt to gather possible rivals together so they could all be executed at once. As a result, instead of a coronation, Wu suddenly had an aristocratic riot on her hands, one that turned into a full-on rebellion, though she was able to stamp it out due to the powers of her surveillance network, dispatching the secret police to the provinces in search of rebels that had gone to ground. Over the next few years, her troops would root out dissenters, through raids and torture, supposedly sawing off nearly a dozen branches of her husband's family tree. By the next year, her opponents were defeated, and she inaugurated the Ming Tang with an elaborate series of sacrifices, conducting the first ceremonies before her son, the Emperor Ruzong, making it clear she ranked above him. Then the next year, on October 16, 1690, it became official. Under his mother's pressure, Ruzong ceded the imperial title to her and accepted a new title as imperial successor. This woman, who had begun merely as Lady Wu, was now known as the female Emperor Wu. For such an unprecedented move, there was little resistance. Well, except from the Earth itself. Supposedly, the day she formally took the throne began with an earthquake. When religious figures warned that this was an ill omen, Emperor Wu said they were wrong. This was the cosmos rejoicing, making the mountains thrust upward towards the heavens in celebration. And what were they celebrating but the beginning of a new dynasty? For Wu would not be ruling under the dynasty of Tang, but rather found her own. The Wu-Zhou Dynasty. Harkening back to the early Zhou period that was seen as a golden age, Wu adopted the Zhou calendar and the words for days and months, as well as changed court terms and titles to bring it in line with the Zhou. And along with all of this came a new name for Wu herself. Not Wu Zetian, that would be her posthumous name. No, her name would be Wu-Zhou. In fact, she created a new character for Zhou, picturing the sun and moon shining over an endless sky. This was one of a dozen new characters she created or modified in her reign, which is nuts, because while making up new words is a normal thing in Western languages, you just don't do that in Chinese, even if you're an international brand. Yet she didn't stop at expanding language. Wu was recruiting more than new characters after all. She heavily staffed up, strengthening the bureaucracy with men of ability using the examination system. In this, she employed both a book she personally wrote on government service and started the tradition of examining scholars herself. There were, after all, a lot of officials to replace. For Wu's reign would be a bloody one, split with plots, intrigues, and a huge number of executions. Some were her political enemies, the aristocratic families she was trying to break, while others were her own family for plotting against the throne or each other. She killed a son, her daughter-in-law, her favorite secretary. Yet, despite this bloodshed, Wu's rule was generally characterized by stability, able government, and artistic achievement. Tang writing flourished, and despite the many wars, she kept China's sphere of influence. Her sponsorship of Buddhism heavily expanded and legitimized the religion, and she ordered the construction of the famous Wild Goose Pagoda. Meanwhile, her keen interests in land reform and expanding prosperity for the common people meant she had a broad base of support. So where did things fall apart, you ask? Well, that would have started with her boy toys. See, Wu played with gender a lot, doing a lot of things as male emperors would do them, and that included keeping a group of young men as an unofficial harem. And no shade there. The problem was, she also kept appointing these boy toys to official positions. Like the one she made a Buddhist priest so he could visit her in her chambers where men weren't allowed, then put him in charge of both a monastery and a military campaign, both of which he bungled. So then she made him a chief overseer of the Ming Tang's construction, which he supposedly burned down along with an adjoining temple after finding out Wu had taken a new lover. In retribution, Wu hired a group of stout women to ambush him upon entering the palace, wrestle him to the ground, and strangle him to death. But really, that was nothing compared to the saga of the Zhang brothers, a duo of boy toys Wu became enamored with at the age of 75. The Zhang brothers had a few foibles that made them unpopular at court. For example, they frequently dressed and presented as women, and may have been eunuchs. Wu gave them charge of a new literary department, which they basically turned into a frat house. Then, when one brother claimed to be a reincarnated Taoist immortal, she staged an elaborate spectacle of him ascending to heaven, where he mounted a large wooden crane and played the flute as a mechanical device winched him to the ceiling. But when a court official put the Zhangs on trial for corruption and beating a slave to death, Wu not only got them acquitted, she appointed one of them to investigate the prosecutor, who ended up being banished. But that kerfuffle was not the only rockiness in the empire, for Wu was getting old, and the prospect of succession unsettled the country. The years of executions and attempted coups began to take their toll. Wu tried to calm things down by recalling the formerly exiled Emperor Zhongzong, who remained popular, and naming him crown prince. Meanwhile, Wu, now 81, became ill and secluded herself, speaking only to the Zhangs. By 705, though, many thought Wu had lost a step and should finally retire, and that the cruel Zhang brothers needed to die. February 20th, 705. Zhongzong breaks into Wu's private chambers, with 500 men at his back. They have swords and armor. No one's seen the Empress in months. The Zhang brothers are in the inner courtyard, and they barely have time to raise their arms in defense before the mob is on them, shouting and hitting, forcing them to their knees. Then, swords fall. 2 heads hit the dirt of the courtyard. Then everything goes quiet. Empress Wu emerges from her bedchamber. The crowd bows in reverence as she looks down at her son. "So it's you," she says. "Now that the 2 boys are dead, you can return to your palace." She then chided the crowd for waking her and told them to quiet down and get out. The next day, Zhongzong took formal command of the empire under the banner of the restored Tang Dynasty, and Wu moved into a different palace. She died 8 months later, interred next to her husband in the enormous mausoleum they'd built decades before. Yet, despite that, the gigantic stele outside her tomb, meant to record the accomplishments of her life and reign, was left blank. The Tang, for their part, revered her, but then also tried to prevent later princesses from following her path, tightening the reins on female power. Regardless of the blank stele, though, China never quite forgot Wu, partially because of her exaggerated reputation for seduction and violence, which did make her a compelling character in plays and stories. In fact, today, Chinese consumers can buy Wu Zetian-inspired costumes and branded perfume or watch soap operas based on her life. This young girl, who came to court, originally valued only for her beauty, had ruled for around 4 decades, expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and had changed both the administrative and religious landscapes of China forever. And while it is a shame that Wu's legacy was not recorded on those steles in her time, not gonna lie, I can kind of see the benefit of not having a bunch of my personal data out there for everyone to see, which is where today's sponsor Incogni comes in handy. So until we started working with Incogni, I really had no idea about how much information was being sold and published by data brokers online, and also how many people search sites there were putting up personal info on the internet for everyone to see, which really does make it almost impossible to keep my data private on my own. Not to mention your data being sold can lead to any number of issues, ranging from the constant annoyance of robocalls all the way up to the absolutely catastrophic stuff like identity theft. But now with Incogni, I am not alone in this fight, because after a very speedy sign-up, they got to work bombarding these shadowy parasites with takedown notices to remove my personal info. Plus, they keep the pressure on, using local laws and ordinances to make sure my data stays removed for good. And I get to keep track of it all through their real-time dashboard and email updates. Heck, I opened my inbox this morning to see that 97 removal requests had been completed in only a few months. Let's go! So if you want to keep your personal data, your personal data, right now you can get 60% off Incogni by visiting incogni.com/extra credits, and then use our code extra credits. You can click right here to get started, and then once you've ruined a data broker's day, why not reward yourself with another videos here? The biggest beam thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angelo Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Izzy Coin, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, and Michael Hoggett for being our legendary patrons.